Hello, hello. This is Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks, Bilingual Decision Making. This is part 2 of the introduction. So if you're just tuning in or just subscribed to this particular podcast, part 1 I talked about the introduction. This is an introductory presentation, and this comes from a presentation I did in Mexico in October 2018 to a group of students in language and culture at a university in Puebla, Mexico. And so in the first recording, I did about half of the intro presentation, and now I'll do the rest of it. So I'm trying to keep each recording limited. I don't want to talk forever and ever, and if you like it the first time around, you can certainly subscribe second time around. So in the first part, we talked about the definitions of culture, cognition, and change. And the reason why is because this whole presentation I did in Mexico is called Culture, Cognition, and Change. And we kind of walked through each of those. Where we left off is talking about intercultural competence, which is the theme I covered the first day. So if you just subscribed, I did a week-long series of presentations. The intro, the first day was intercultural competence. By the end of the week, I talked about adaptive leadership. So I'm Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks, Culture, Cognition, and Change. And here's my logo, and this is the three C's in Dr. Z. So intercultural competence. What is intercultural competence? Well, if you look at the circle, in the image, it says having the skills and awareness to build relationships across cultures, which is pretty good thing. So earlier in the first part of this Culture, Cognition, and Change recording, I talked about that I am from Denver, Colorado. I'm from Colorado originally, but I actually lived in 6 states. I asked students which ones. So I'll say them out loud. If you have the presentation in front of you, you can just see for yourself. So I was born in Colorado, so obviously I lived there. I also lived in Missouri, a small town, for a while. So state number 2. State number 3 is in the west. It's called Utah. So I lived there. Went to high school for a little while before eventually moving on to Kansas. So that's state 4. State 5 is California. It's really incredible place, California. It's more like a country. It's so big and so culturally diverse. It's really a phenomenal place in the world. So I lived in California, both near San Francisco and Los Angeles. So I got to see both significant parts. But if you go to Northern California, it's incredible as well, or Eastern California, Central California. All of California is really an amazing place. And finally, state number 6 is Arizona, which is the place where I'm recording this particular podcast right now. So, what is your definition of intercultural competence? You have something in mind? Well, during the presentation, I showed 3 overlapping circles, Venn diagrams. You've seen these before where 2 diagrams overlap. And then at the intersection, you can say, well, that's where things intersect. That's where there's commonalities between these 2 phenomena. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So how we have 3 overlapping circles labeled Culture A, Culture B, and Culture C. Now, when we just talk about 2 cultures going across or connecting with one another, we say cross-cultural. So when we say cross-cultural, we're really talking about just 2 cultures, or 2 languages, or 2 of anything. If we have 3 things, then we're talking about interculture. So there can be cross-cultural competence or intercultural competence. They're very closely related because if you learn a lot about a second culture or a second language, you can take those skills very quickly and apply them to a new one because you then have developed a lot of meta-awareness about how to interact with different people. One kind of thing you can develop very quickly is don't make assumptions, and also accept that there's probably a good reason why a second culture does things in a different way. If you have 3 of them together, it's an intercultural thing. So think about large cities anywhere in the world. They're going to have lots of different people coming together, or indigenous groups within the borders of a country that, those indigenous groups were there long before our current nation state. So there's a lot of intercultural things in our own lives. So definition, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to be effective and appropriate in the intercultural space. And the effective and appropriate are both extremely important, because you can be effective and get what you want, but you can upset people. And if you come back later and try to get something, then maybe they won't work with you, because even though you were effective for you, you weren't appropriate for them. So that's why we have the effective and appropriate in this definition. So what are some cognitive and emotional aspects of intercultural competence? So what I have on the slide is two tables. One's cognitive, one's emotional, and they go from left to right. So starting with cognitive, we have 6 components. We have knowledge. Knowledge then relates to comprehension. This is the cognitive aspect of intercultural competence. Knowledge relates to comprehension. Comprehension relates to application. How do you apply your knowledge? Application then goes to analysis. You analyze why things are a certain way. Eventually you get around to synthesizing. So you can operate in a different world in a different way very well, because you've synthesized how people operate in a different place and how you operate in that different place. That's very, very important. And finally, evaluation. You can evaluate intercultural competence. The emotional things, this is also from left to right. There's 5 of them. So the emotional aspects of intercultural competence include receiving. And so you receive the world. This is a very sort of general idea of reception. You just receive the world as it is. And eventually you respond to the world. And so think about crossing into another country, let's say United States into Mexico. You can see the changes very quickly. You eventually just receive sort of stimuli. But at some point, let's say you're out at a restaurant, someone asks you what you want, you have to respond. Maybe you respond in your first language, maybe you're trying to respond in the second language. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Now that's actually, I think, you do with your words, but it works emotionally as well. You're receiving intercultural competence and then responding to it. It can be negative or positive, afraid, excited, all of those things mixed together. Eventually, you value emotionally the world around you and intercultural competence. Then you start to organize emotionally, like, well, I think this person I saw might have been behaving this way because of X, Y, and Z. You start to categorize things and organize things, and you start to then develop your own theories about why people behave a certain way, emotionally. And also, you're thinking about yourself, how do I behave a certain way in this environment that's appropriate for the culture, but also appropriate for me in this culture, because you, being in a culture, changes the dynamics of that culture as well. So then how do you operate yourself? And finally, we internalize emotionally the emotional aspects of intercultural competence. So the next thing, and I can tell you during the week I was at the university, the brain and language thing was the most fascinating thing for a lot of the students. So brain and language, and just talk a little bit about them. So we have different parts of the human brain. So if you're not watching the video, you can talk about the brain in multiple ways. I took a very simple approach just to introduce people to the brain generally. So at the front part of the brain, if we're looking from right to left, so on the right-hand side of the brain, you've seen an image of the brain before with all the divots and the curves and so forth, is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is towards the back. So we're going to start at the front. The front of the brain is called the frontal lobe. And that's pretty basic, and that's a really important part. Directly behind the frontal lobe is called the parietal lobe. And then directly behind there, at the back of the head, is called the occipital lobe. Now if we continue going forward again, then we run into the temporal lobe. And it's those 4 parts of the brain that we focus on the most when we talk about brain and language. There's also the cerebellum and the spinal cord towards the base of the brain. Now one question I asked, the participants was, how does brain enable language? So next to this image of the brain I have with the parts of the brain highlighted, I have a box. What if our brain was designed like a box? Would that change language? Would that change the way language is delivered? Would that change our sound system? Would that change the organization system of the brain? How would that change the brain? So the question, how does brain enable language? I'll just leave you with that because it's a pretty cool question. So the next question I asked the participants is whether the brain is modular or integrated. So modular, the idea of modular is that there's a single point in the brain that deals with a certain particular thing. And that's been the way that people thought about these things for a long time. More recent ways of thinking about the brain talks about integrated. So you need multiple parts of the brain, multiple activities, multiple actions, coordinating together to do one task. And so the picture I have on the slide is, again, of a brain, and there's 3 points that are highlighted in the front of the brain, the frontal lobe, talking about abstract thought, working memory. Towards the back, on the side, temporal lobe, is called language comprehension, and then in front of there is called speech. And so, when we do any of these activities, speech, language comprehension, abstract thought, memory, are we talking about a modular working brain where one part is doing one thing, or are we talking about an integrated brain where there's multiple parts of the brain activated to do one particular thing? So that's a big question that people ask who study the brain. Is the brain modular or is it integrated? So modules have distinct language functions. Integrated networks coordinate two complete functions. And I think there's a grammatical mistake on this slide, so look at that. So the next thing I talked about during the introduction, and I'll talk about it later, is bilingual decision making. So this is obviously the thing I talk about quite a bit. So what is bilingual decision making? Well, it's the study of how decision making may vary as a function of language competence. That's my own definition. So I'll talk that out a little bit. So if you're a second language speaker, you have a level of competence in the second language. You might be an expert. You might have lived there longer. You might write better than a native speaker. You might actually know more words than a native speaker. You might do things better than a native speaker. But oftentimes we're talking about people who are learning. They're in the process of acquiring a new language, and so they're learning, and so they're making mistakes, and they're getting better. So if we just take a person at any given time, we're not talking about beginners, we're talking about people who can really function in a second language at a high level. If we take them at any given time, we say, okay, how are you doing with X, Y, and Z, and compare them to a native speaker. That's what I mean when I say in the definition, bilingual decision-making is the study of how decision-making may vary as a function of language competence. So your language competence, measured by your sound production, your comprehension, your written skills, etc., and then compare that to a first language speaker. So bilingual decision-making is a combination of different things: applied linguistics, represented by a box, plus decision-making, represented by a circle, equals bilingual decision-making, which is represented by a triangle. It's kind of a sophisticated triangle. Someone else who knows geometry probably knows the exact term for that. I don't know what it is offhand. So we basically have a box plus a circle equals a triangle. We go applied linguistics plus decision-making equals bilingual decision-making. At least that's how I constructed it in my own mind through this long homework assignment called a dissertation. Thing. During the introduction, we talked about cross-cultural decision-making, which we talked about already a little bit. So cross-cultural decision-making, what is it? What's the definition? What's your definition? It's the study of how people from various cultures interact in decision-making situations, communication, negotiation, business. So this actually has some different traditions behind it. So people who study negotiation and business and work across cultures, they have very specific reasons why they want to study cross-cultural decision-making. A Japanese person is going to behave in one particular way during a negotiation, and an American person, an American businessman or a businesswoman might behave in a different way in a negotiation situation. And it's important if you certainly want to do your best to negotiate well, to understand how someone else might operate and what their goals are during that negotiation. So there's a lot of those traditions in cross-cultural decision-making. What I have on the slide is just a simple sort of graph. So if we talk about cross-cultural decision-making, we go from culture, and then we have a line to differences. From differences, there's a line to interactions. And at this point, we can talk about two ways of thinking about cross-cultural decision-making. One is programmed, and one is non-programmed. So programmed might be an event that someone organizes to have a group of students who are coming from, let's say, Germany to the United States. So the 15 German students show up in a room, and the person who organized the event has very clear agenda items to do, such as have those people sit next to an American, so they have to then interact formally, or at least there's a formalized approach to putting people together. So that would be an idea of programmed decision-making and programmed cross-cultural decision-making. You put people together. Non-programmed would be you just say, there's a party, everyone mingle as you wish. That might mean that there's two groups of people, one stands on one side of the room and one stands on the other side of the room. But that would be a result of a non-programmed thing. But maybe there's a few people on either sides of the room that eventually do interact. So, final thing is adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership. Now, how does this all relate to a bunch of applied linguistic kind of things or bilingual decision-making things? So, adaptive leadership is a practical leadership that helps people adapt and succeed in challenging environments. And when I talk more about this later, you'll understand. But there's some basic ideas about adaptive leadership are these. So it's based on evolutionary biology, and the three principles of adaptive leadership are preserve, discard, and create. Like I said, it comes from evolutionary biology. So you want to preserve all the good things about your own culture, your own language, your own thought processes, your family, your connections, all of those things, right? So number one, in any adaptive leadership setting, and I think this works for cross-cultural things, I think it works for decision-making, I think it works for learning another language, is preserving all the good things, and there's plenty of it. But the second thing is also extremely important, and that means discard. So we're going to discard the things that do not help us in that new environment. So one example I can think of is that in English we use the words should, could, would, and they're called modal verbs, and we place them in front of main verbs. So could you help me? So could is the modal, help is the main verb. Could you help me? Would you help me? Those kind of things. And we use those to show politeness, to make requests, etc. Well, some languages don't have those, or even if they have them, they don't use them as much. So Spanish, it's more normal just to say, give it to me, which if you put that in English, immediately sounds rude, but in the Spanish context, it isn't rude. It's just a way to get something done quicker. So if you're going from one language to the other, you have to sort of discard certain ideas about politeness, because the way politeness is expressed in other languages is different. So it's very polite to give something to someone immediately when they're asking for it. You can think about customer service. From one cultural perspective, it would be rude if you don't use those words. So you have to discard certain thoughts you have in a second language, for example, about what constitutes polite or impolite. And finally, through the adaptation process, preserve, discard, we create new things, we create new connections in our brains. When we new languages, we suddenly can see the world through slightly different eyes, we can analyze things differently. So that's a create. Again, this comes from evolutionary biology. So the three things: preserve, discard, and create. There's some record. A DJ is putting some tracks down and mixing them. So this is now the end of the introduction I did at the University in Mexico in October 2018. I was asked to redo these because the sound quality during the presentations, while it was nice, it captured a lot, it didn't have the sound quality that this presentation has. This has been the 3 C's introduction: cognition, culture, cognition, and change. Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks. And I had people take a little quiz. If you want to take a quiz at some point, you can email me and ask me for that. At any rate, thanks for tuning in. Tune in again for the next presentation, or check out other podcasts. The next presentation I'm going to talk about is on intercultural competence exclusively. We'll do a deep dive into that, and it should be accessible to you. If you've never studied it before, it should be interesting. If you've studied it before, maybe you still get something out of it. Anyway, have a good afternoon, and happy deciding.